Alright guys, how's it going? So I'm finally getting onto this Ryzen review. Obviously I got my sample late, but it got here eventually. And before I start, I just want to say a big thank you to MSI especially for bailing me out on very, very short notice. They got the X370 Titanium to me and the GTX 1070 from the Netherlands to Sweden in less than 24 hours. So that was very, very short notice and they really came through for me. But now let's get started with the review itself. Today I'm going to be reviewing the R7 1800X, AMD's new flagship 8-core 16-thread CPU, which has 3.6 GHz base clock and 4 GHz boost clock. In actual fact, it runs around 3.7 GHz with all 16 threads loaded and around 4.1 GHz with one single thread. That is due to their new technology, XFR. The R7 1700 has a 3 GHz base clock and 3.7 GHz single core turbo. And what's more, it also has XFR, however it only has half the XFR turbo compared to the 1800X. Also released at this time is the R7 1700X, which I do not yet have. Now, it is extremely important to note that Ryzen is a grounds up brand new design. And there are some differences to what has gone before. For example, on the 213 square millimeter CPU, we can clearly see two core complexes, which communicate with each other through AMD's data fabric, their Infinity fabric. So this is all new, and may lead to some issues, but we'll see about that later. Due to everything being so new, there are of course one or two platform issues too. There are constant new BIOS updates, but right now, most samples are limited to 2667 MHz memory. This will improve over time, but due to that I have decided that 2667 MHz memory on all CPUs capable of that speed is the fairest way forward here. So the 6900K, the 6800K, the 7700K and both Ryzen CPUs in my benchmarks today are running at 2667 MHz memory. The i5-2500K is at 1600 MHz. Otherwise, the test systems are identical, running on the same test bench, the same operating system, and all that stuff. The only differences being the CPU and the motherboard. Right, so time to move on to the part that you all really came for, the benchmarks. I'm going to start off with a little fun benchmark. Do you remember 3D Mark 6? No? What about now? Do you remember it now? This is a benchmark that I used to run on a daily basis way back then when I had my 8800 GT and my Q6600, and I thought that the CPU benchmark would be a fun one to try out. And as it turns out, it's a pretty decent benchmark. It seems to work well with extra cores, clock speed, and even IPC. So looking at the scores, the R7 1800X ekes out a very, very small win, with the i7 6900K coming in just ahead of the 7700K. The reason I know that it likes cores and clock speeds is that the i7 6800K is above the R7 1700. So a bit of a weak result here to start with for the 1700. As you might expect, the 2500K is well behind, but maybe not as far behind the 1700 as you might have expected. So interesting enough, but pretty academic. We'll see how much that means moving on. To 7-zip compression benchmark. Now there are two 7-zip benchmarks, compression and decompression. Obviously when you're compressing a zip file, you're grabbing a bunch of files and sticking it into an archive and making it smaller. In this instance, the 6900K has a pretty big lead over both the Ryzen CPUs, with the 6800K not being that far away from the 1700. We can see that this benchmark is very well threaded, with the i5 especially being pretty far behind. Now looking at the decompression though, that is of course opening archives or unzipping, and the R7 1800X scores a very good win, 10% ahead in millions of instructions per second. Now this is what I would call a good trade-off, as most of the time we will be decompressing archives rather than compressing. If you just consider, how often do you unzip an archive compared to how often you create one? So that's a pretty good trade-off for the Ryzen CPUs here. Right, moving on to Cinebench R15 single thread. Now the single thread performance here is simply clock speed multiplied by IPC. And in this case the R7 1800X is running at 4.1 GHz thanks to XFR, whereas the 6900K is running at 4 GHz with Turbo Boost 3.0 switched on. So with that we can see that those two CPUs have very similar IPC, with Broadwell just a tiny 2% ahead. The i7 7700K though, with its blazing fast 4.5 GHz single core turbo, and of course Skylake's IPC, is well ahead here. The old Sandy Bridge i5 still hanging in there as well. But when we move over to Cinebench R15 multi-thread, we see something very, very interesting. Presumably with 8 cores and 8 threads, the R7 1800X and the i7 6900K should have had similar scores, but in actual fact, the 1800X is well ahead now. Again by around 10%, and one of the reasons for this is AMD's superior simultaneous multi-threading, which is really quite something when you think about it. Given that this is Intel's 5th generation, they had hyper-threading on the old Pentium 4 of course, then they ditched it, before bringing it back with the Nehalem generation. That's your i7 920, your i7 950. And it did of course continue on with Sandy Bridge, Ivy Bridge, Haswell, Broadwell, and finally Skylake. That's 5 generations of their current hyper-threading, and AMD has overtaken them with their very first effort. So that is really quite interesting to see, and something that could be interesting to pay attention to moving forward. What is really notable is how close the 1700 gets to the 6900K, and just how far ahead it is of the 6800K. Now, one of the reasons why Cinebench is seen so much is that it is a known quantity. The scores really do not deviate by that much, and they are also very unlikely to be affected by memory scaling, at least until now. I took the chance to check this out, and like I said before, the maximum memory speed available to Ryzen right now in this BIOS was 2667 MHz, and that is how I managed to get the score of 161 single thread and 1624 multi-thread. But very interestingly, at lower memory speeds, the scores dropped, but only the multi-threading score. There's not a great deal in it. It's only around 2% difference between 2133 and 2667 MHz DDR4, but it was still a repeatable difference. Looking at the i7, it actually loses a couple of points, but that's more like margin of error. So very interesting. Cinebench really shouldn't be throwing out these results with memory scaling. Now, possibly even more interesting to some of you was how Cinebench scaled with the core complex test. In this current BIOS with the R7 1800X, I could choose to have 2 cores on one complex and 0 on the other, or 1 core in each. And here are the results. As we can see, the 2+0 configuration is ahead in both multi and single threading. So that's a kind of curious result, and perhaps points to an issue with communication between both core complexes. If the scores are higher when only one core complex is being used, and lower when both are available, then that could point to some kind of architectural weakness, or something that has to be specifically coded around. This whole issue here has been a massive talking point over the past couple of weeks. Right, moving on to Corona, which is a very interesting ray tracing benchmark, and here you're looking at the time taken to render the scene. So in this case, the lower numbers are of course better. 1800X at the top again, it is very good at this kind of workload and consistently appears to be 10% faster than the 6900K while doing this kind of thing. The 1700 manages a tie here, but look at the old i5 down the bottom. That is a long, long way behind. Now, the final non-gaming benchmark is CPU Z single thread, and I just wanted to add this one because I found it incredibly interesting. Again, what you're seeing here is single-threaded performance, but in this case, the R7 1800X actually beats the i7 7700K. Even with the clock speed deficit, we can see the 1800X just winning here. The 1700 is also a mile ahead of the 6900K. So what's going on here? I'm not entirely sure, but it is clearly a very, very good benchmark for the AMD CPUs. And the reason that I wanted to show this is that it does prove that there are workloads out there where Ryzen is very, very fast, even in single thread. But we still don't know if this is because the Intel CPUs are being hamstrung somehow here. All of the Intel scores kind of line up otherwise. Looking at the multi-threaded score, however, it's an absolute massacre, with the 1800X being ridiculously far ahead of the 6900K, and the R7 1700 also putting in a very good showing. I wouldn't get too caught up in these CPU Z results, but you just never know. It's highly unlikely that CPU Z has been specifically optimized, but there are a lot of applications out there, and it could just well be that this one got lucky, kind of like it's been optimized by default, or just sheer chance. So this is something that's worth thinking about, and it's worth keeping an eye on this one, just to see how it develops. But let's move on to the gaming benchmarks. Now, the most time-consuming and boring part of this review has been benchmarking the games. I have one or two beliefs about benchmarking, but the main one is that the reviewer should actually play through the game while benchmarking. I completely disagree with inbuilt benchmarks. To be blunt, more often than not, the results that you see in an in-game benchmark are frequently much different from what you see while actually gaming. So that is my rule number 1. Play through these games while benching. So that's every CPU through every benchmark multiple times in order to get an accurate result. The one game that I do not play through is Ashes of the Singularity. So in many ways, I do not consider this to be an actual gaming benchmark. It is more of a CPU benchmark. So ramp the settings up to maximum, running in DX12 in order to run the CPU benchmark. Ashes of the Singularity should scale to 16 threads, and therefore should be a very good benchmark with Ryzen, but it's not. And in actual fact, the 1800X is languishing behind the 7700K, even though it has double the threads. Ashes of the Singularity actually scales ridiculously well with everything: cores, clock speeds, IPC. And this is why the 7700K is so far ahead of the 2500K here. In actual fact, more than double the score. It does of course have a very large clock speed advantage, but this was completely unexpected and required further testing. So that's what I did. The first thing I tried was dropping the memory down to 2133 MHz and then switching SMT off, so only 8 threads instead of 16, and the drop was only 1 frame per second. So immediately we can see that there is a major optimization issue going on here. Next up, once again, I tried with the 1+1 cores and 2+0 cores in each complex. And once again we see that 2+0 scores higher than 1+1. Exactly what we saw with Cinebench, and here we see a difference of around 9%. We are seeing this elsewhere, and there is clearly some kind of drop in performance when moving from one core complex to the other. At the bottom we can see 2667 MHz DDR4, which is the final score. Very big increase in memory as well. This is all just starting to add up now to something obvious. The main one is simply optimization, and the Ashes developers have said that they are working on this, and the results so far are promising. With a bit of luck, we won't have to wait too long until we see just how promising this is. But these differences in performance between the core complexes and the consistent differences we see with faster RAM certainly points to some kind of communication issue, which will hopefully just be about optimization, or in worst case, faster RAM. Now moving on to DSX, which is the first true gaming benchmark, you can see that by now I am down to both Ryzen CPUs, and I decided to stick with the 7700K and the 2500K. DX11 on the GTX 1070, ultra settings and no motion blur. I never use motion blur in any games, so this makes the games a little bit less likely to be fully GPU limited. We can see here that the results are basically a wash. Very small win for the 7700K at 1080p. At 1440p they're all running around 51 frames per second, and at 4K we're just below 30 frames per second. Now moving on to Doom, rather interesting results I found here, running of course on the Vulkan API, ultra settings. I benched this over and over to figure out what was going on, but I just kept getting the same results. The 7700K was consistently just 1 or 2 frames behind both the Ryzen CPUs, regardless of resolution. I am more inclined, however, to put this one down to a testing error, which I simply could not figure out given the lack of time. It's all completely academic because the experience is the same on all 3 CPUs. Interesting to see though that the 2500K cannot keep up at 1080p. It would probably be fine with a 5 GHz overclock, of course, but at stock speeds the 2500K is quite a way behind the rest of the CPUs here. Now moving on to Fallout 4, again DX11 ultra settings with no motion blur, and a pretty interesting result. I already knew how this was going to work out. Fallout 4 is a terribly optimised game, which seems to want to grab all the memory speed you can throw at it, as well as a very strong single thread. And in this case, at 1080p and at 1440p, the 7700K has quite a commanding lead over both Ryzen CPUs. In most cases, you should of course be GPU limited at 1440p, but in this case, the 1800X and the 1700 are for some reason holding back the GTX 1070. Everything runs the same at 4K, of course, but again, after looking at this, I thought, gonna need to do more testing here for Fallout 4. The obvious one is of course the RAM speed. Now this is with the 1800X, and the difference that the memory speed makes is just incredible. We're down below 90 frames per second with 2133 MHz, moving up to over 100 frames per second with the 2667 MHz DDR4. For memory to be doing that in a game is just ridiculous, but we've already seen it in Ashes and in Cinebench. Interestingly, with SMT off, at the same 2667MHz DDR4 memory, we see a drop of 6 frames per second. Again, this is just purely about optimization. Fallout 4 is notoriously badly optimized, and I would pretty much consider this to be worst case scenario that you will see for Ryzen. There may be one or two other games out there that are extremely poorly optimized, but there won't be many more throwing up results like this. The game developers Bethesda have a history of rather poorly optimized games, and this is probably why AMD has targeted them for a tie-in, so it very much looks like future games coming out of Bethesda will be coded for the Vulkan API. This should mean that future Bethesda games will be much better optimized, especially for multi-threading. Whether or not AMD will go back and fix their Fallout 4 performance, I really don't think so. But you never know. Now moving on to Hitman, DX11 again, ultra settings. Once again, the 7700K has a very small win of a few frames per second, nothing you would ever notice. The 2500K however does fall a little bit behind the rest of the CPUs. There's basically no difference at 1440p and 4K. And the final game tested was Rise of the Tomb Raider. Once again, DX11, ultimate settings and no motion blur. And another slight curiosity here, with once again at 1440p, both Ryzen CPUs consistently scoring 1 to 2 frames higher. This was tested over and over and the same results kept being thrown out. Again, it's all pretty academic as there is absolutely no perceptible difference while gaming. 2500K falls a little bit behind again at 1080p. Right, so here's the thing. A lot of people have been spooked by this 1080p performance in some games. There are a bunch of ways to look at this. And one obvious way is that anybody spending $300 plus on a CPU is likely running a faster graphics card, at least GTX 1070 level like I am using here, and there's also a fair chance that they will be running 1440p or even 4K resolution. As you've seen, the results are pretty much a wash at those resolutions, and everything apart from Fallout I think. But people have been spooked by this, and it doesn't really seem to make sense, especially given the really good application performance where Ryzen is well ahead of the 6900K in many cases. Now I did talk about this in a recent video, there is no good reason for why this should be happening in some games outside of optimization, and I firmly believe this is the case. Because if it wasn't the case, then Ryzen would be losing in every game that shows CPU scaling. But that is not the case. Most recently, Steve over at TechSpot discovered that running Mafia 3, the 1800X beats out the 5960X and also the 7700K. Now, you can see the 6900K at the top here, a little bit ahead, so the game must scale very well with extra threads or extra cache. Whatever the reason, in a game that shows CPU scaling at 1080p, Ryzen is more than holding its own. And if it can do it in one game, it can do it in every game, given the optimization. Remember what I said about CPU-Z early on in the video? How CPU-Z could be sort of optimized by default? We could be seeing something similar here with Mafia 3. One thing I'm pretty certain about is that the developers of Mafia 3, pretty sure they did not deliberately optimize for Ryzen or AMD CPUs. What it all comes down to for me is the hyperthreading is so good on Ryzen. Even though the 6900K and the 1800X have very similar single-threaded performance, as we've seen, the superior hyperthreading of the Ryzen CPUs could start to make a difference. There are other things to consider as well. For example, overclocking. The 1800X does not overclock very far because it's already pretty close to its limit. Now, the 6900K doesn't overclock very far either, so that's not a big problem. What this really comes down to for me is there are very, very few use cases where having a CPU like the 7700K actually makes that much of a difference. And you tend to find that where the difference is really seen, for example, games like Fallout 4 and maybe Grand Theft Auto 5, these are games that have simply always preferred strong single threads or higher frequencies. I already talked about how the Ashes developers will be optimizing for Ryzen. Creative Assembly will be doing the same. That's the Total War guys. And we know that AMD recently signed the tie-in with Bethesda Studios. The thing here is AMD has very deep relations with a lot of gaming companies, which is of course mostly through the Radeon graphics brand. Intel just doesn't have this. And if you really pay attention to it, AMD is really grabbing hold of a lot of these companies. Guys like Rebellion from Sniper. You've got DICE, the Battlefield guys, Chris Roberts at Star Citizen, you've got Nixies, the Thief guys. The point I'm making here is that future games will be optimized around Ryzen. There is no question about that. Now, it has to be said that AMD never claimed the Ryzen would be the ultimate gaming CPU. They simply said it is a great enthusiast CPU and enthusiast gamer CPU. Ryzen, or at least the 1800X, has really been angled as a prosumer CPU. In other words, guys that do a lot of content creation and gaming. And one of the angles that they attacked the 7700K at was through gaming and streaming at the same time. Now, I'm purely on YouTube, but I thought I would put this one to the test. So what you're looking at here is Fallout on the i7 7700K while recording using OBS. You can quite clearly see that the CPU numbers are going to 100% and there is some pretty evident stuttering here. Even though the game is running at 90 frames per second, had I been streaming with this, then the audience would be seeing this stuttering gameplay. It's actually quite evident in certain parts. Now, this is 120 frames per second 1080p, and it is extremely evident now that the 7700K simply cannot play and stream at this sort of frame rate. Moving over to the 1800X, 60 frames per second 1080p. Now, the frame rate is actually down about 60 frames per second while playing. However, you can quite clearly see that this is very, very smooth. So even in this horribly optimized game for Ryzen, the gameplay and streaming is actually really, really good. Way better than you can ever get on a 7700K. Now, just how relevant is this though? Because obviously you might think, well, you would just use Shadowplay or you would simply use QuickSync on the 7700K instead. But the fact of the matter is, most of these high level streamers are in fact using software encoding rather than these hardware encoders, and the reason for that is simply one of image quality. This will be very difficult to show here because after I upload the video, YouTube is going to mangle it anyway. But I did in fact compare Shadowplay, which is of course Nvidia's hardware encoder, to the OBS X264 software encoder. The differences are most notable in light and dark areas, where simply put there is a blurriness to the image that you just do not see when using the X264 software encoder. So this is a quality thing. And this is what AMD means by the prosumer. There are other ways around it, of course, and many of the high-end streamers are using two PCs, one for gaming and one for streaming, using a capture card. Another option, of course, may well be to game using the 6900K. This is simply about the number of cores. The 7700K does not have enough cores to do both game and stream with the software encoder at the same time. You will always get stutters. The Ryzen CPUs do have enough, and what's more, the 1800X is capable of running indistinguishable settings, at least in Fallout 4. Your mileage is going to vary, but if you are serious about streaming, or even just getting a little bit more image quality on YouTube, Software X264 is superior to stuff like Shadowplay, and a CPU like the Ryzen 7 1700 is by far and away the cheapest way to get that kind of quality. So that's what AMD really means by the prosumer choice. But there's more to it than that, of course, because guys like me who are uploading to YouTube, a video like this will render in half the time for me than it does on the 7700K. Right, to wrap this one up, I've got two CPUs. In actual fact, the 1700X has just arrived at my doorstep, so I now have all three Ryzen 7 CPUs. You've got the 1800X at the top. It is an absolute monster in applications. It chews through stuff like Cinebench in no time whatsoever. It's incredible to watch it actually, and when it comes to all your video encoding, transcoding stuff, it is just so incredibly fast. In gaming, I have noticed no difference whatsoever, even in Fallout, because the reality is, difference between 101 and 129 frames per second is practically imperceptible anyway. In actual fact, the experience was worse on the 7700K, and I've captured the reason for that on video. As I've said plenty of times in this video already, there's something wrong with Fallout's optimization, and when you get to a certain frame rate, the game kind of bugs out and your character starts running faster. You can see this especially inside when the frame rate is very high. This is why the game is locked to 60 frames per second in the first place. There are other games that kind of crap out at high frame rates as well. For example, Grand Theft Auto craps out around 180, I believe. But what you have here is a situation where the higher frame rate of the 7700K is actually harming the experience. With that said, I don't expect 1080p gaming to be an issue going forward. Ryzen is just inherently fast, but right now it is inherently unoptimized. The choice for me is very simple though. I gain way more from the 8-core 16-thread CPU than I do with the i7 7700K. You guys that have got i7s right now, you are not going to be upgrading to Ryzen anyway, unless you are a prosumer like me. For raw gaming purposes, you're simply not gonna do it. The real comparison is of course against Broadwell E, and whatever Broadwell E CPU you talk about, whether it's the 6950X with 10 cores, $1,700, or the $1,000 6900K, or even the, $400 6800K, every one of them is totally overpriced. The 6900K needs to be $500 in order to compete with the 1800X. The 6800K, the 6850K, they're in a really, really bad spot here because the R7 1700 really does lay waste to it at a cheaper price. The 7700K, I believe, is now no longer worth buying because of the R7 1700. There will be cases. If you really need your 200 plus frames per second in Counter-Strike, well actually, now that I think about it, I'm pretty sure you will also get that with an R7 1700. If you're a 1080p 144Hz gamer like I am, then there could be cases where the 7700 makes sense. I could not find it in my Fallout testing. If I look really, really hard though, there are slight smoothness differences between say 90 and 120 frames per second, but in the vast majority of games, I expect Ryzen and the i7s to be within a few percent, not 25-30% like we see with Fallout 4. For me, the CPU to get right now today is the R7 1700. There is something about looking at those 16 threads that just doesn't get old. And given the option in 2017 of paying $320 for that, or $350 for a quad core with hyperthreading, which at best in low thread count games is going to be a couple of frames per second faster. Once all these optimization issues are fixed, going forward, we can expect to see much more like this Mafia benchmark. It's going to take a few years, like I said. I think Jay actually said it best when he said that Ryzen is a lot better at productivity compared to the i7 7700K than the i7 is compared to Ryzen in gaming. I would like to add to that because the i7 7700K will never be close to Ryzen in productivity. And at some point in the future, because games are moving to 8 cores and they will continue to move there, it's just a case of how fast it gets there. So at some point in the future, what you see in application performance today will be repeated in gaming performance. I stuck the 2500K in there for a reason. It's because it's a CPU that I was very fond of. And you can see that even now it still holds up pretty well in gaming. But in the application results, it gets absolutely thrashed. Ryzen is almost 4 times faster in some cases. The day of the quad core is done, and it's only a matter of time before the quad i7s follow suit. You guys that were holding on to the 2500K, I know there's a lot of you guys out there. The only reason I upgraded to Skylake was because I really felt I needed a modern CPU and it was the only decent choice within my price range. But I grudged paying that money for yet another quad core. Like I said, I had a Q6600 in 2007 and yet here I am in 2017 still with a quad core. And it's because of the way Intel segments the market, and it's basically holding back gaming because of it. The choice is pretty clear for you guys, because the R7 1700 is priced much more palatably and is a quantum leap in performance over the 2500K, and for me is the best CPU out there today. At least after you overclock it up to around 3.9 GHz. You may consider waiting, or you may consider buying in now. Probably the number one factor in deciding whether or not to go with Ryzen or an i7 7700K is that according to AMD at least, the AM4 platform should last through to 2020. We all know that Intel loves to add another pin to their sockets, forcing you to also upgrade motherboard when you buy a new CPU. AM4 should be set to last for at least 3, maybe even 4 Ryzen generations. So even if these kinks aren't ironed out, with these initial Ryzen R7s, future generations almost certainly will, and that will be a drop-in CPU upgrade. I can't guarantee that, and neither can AMD, but that is their plan. A lot depends on whether or not more pins are actually required, for example with a new memory standard. But for me, that is a major selling point. You buy your motherboard today, it lasts you 3-4 years. Right, so that is me wrapping this one up. It's great to see AMD back, and they're not only back, they are back in a big way, because I am convinced that Ryzen is faster than what anybody even realizes, possibly even AMD themselves. After years of nothing happening in the CPU market, with a little bit of luck, 2017 looks set to make up for the previous years of minuscule IPC gains while being stuck with the 4 cores that Intel have given us. I just cannot wait to see what these optimized Ryzen benchmarks are going to look like. I'll catch you later, guys.